The cold that night was relentless. Snow piled up on the sidewalks, and the biting wind made the few souls wandering the streets hunch their shoulders, searching for any trace of warmth. Among those lonely shadows, a man in a worn-out coat stopped in front of a small group of children curled up beneath an awning. Their clothes were dirty, their faces marked by the harshness of life on the streets. But despite the desolation around them, their eyes lit up when they saw what the man held in his hands. Books. Who wants to hear a story? His voice broke through the cold silence, carrying an unexpected tenderness. He sat right there, on the damp ground, opened the book, and began to read. His voice, strong and warm, filled the night, transporting those children to worlds of adventure, hope, and endless possibilities. For a few moments, they forgot about hunger and cold, completely immersed in the magic of the words. But he wasn't doing it for recognition. He didn't want applause or headlines. He just wanted to offer something that no amount of money could buy, the chance to dream. What he didn't know was that, on that very night, someone was watching from afar. That same night, as the snow covered the streets with its white mantle, an elegant man, wrapped in a dark overcoat, stood at a distance, observing the scene. His eyes, hidden behind discreetly framed glasses, reflected curiosity and admiration. He had been there by chance, waiting for a cab that never seemed to arrive, when the sound of the stranger's voice caught his attention. What fascinated him wasn't just the scene itself, but the way the man read. There was passion in his voice, a genuine engagement, as if he himself was diving into the story he was telling. The children, who had been motionless and curled up from the cold, now had smiles on their faces and bright eyes. It was as if, for a brief moment, the harshness of life had been replaced by a glimmer of hope. When the book came to an end, the mysterious reader closed its pages with a careful gesture. Then, he reached into his backpack, pulled out more books, and handed them to the children. Read whenever you can. Stories can take you to incredible places, even without leaving here, he said with a gentle smile. The children thanked him with awkward hugs and shy laughter. Then, he stood up, brushed the snow off his pants, and disappeared into the night, without waiting for any recognition. The man in the overcoat, still watching, furrowed his brow. Something told him this wasn't just a simple storyteller. But who was he? Where did those books come from? And more importantly, why was he doing this without expecting anything in return? Without hesitation, the mysterious observer pulled out his phone and typed a reminder. Find out who the sidewalk writer is. Far from the spotlight and the shelves of bestsellers, Elijah Carter lived a simple life. His apartment was small, lined with bookshelves overflowing with paperbacks, and a couch that had seen better days. The desk by the window was always covered in scattered drafts and pens, signs of a restless mind that never stopped creating. But despite his evident talent, Elijah never sought fame. To him, writing was an act of love, not a path to recognition. By day, he worked in a small bookstore downtown, organizing shelves and recommending titles to hesitant customers. But at night, his true purpose was revealed. With a backpack full of books, he walked to the spots where he knew homeless children gathered. He didn't bring food or money, not because he didn't want to, but because his own financial reality didn't allow for grand gestures. But he brought stories that could warm hearts, even on the coldest nights. It had all started years ago when he saw a boy sitting alone, trying to read a torn piece of newspaper to pass the time. The sight hit him like a punch to the gut. That night, Elijah grabbed one of his own books and went back to the same spot. At first, the boy hesitated, but as soon as he heard the first words, his eyes lit up. From that day on, Elijah made it a habit to return whenever he could. But he had a secret. The books he gave away weren't just any stories. They were his. Written under a pseudonym, printed in the simplest way possible, and distributed anonymously. He never wanted anyone to know who the author behind those words was. He didn't want credit, only the certainty that his writing was making a difference in someone's life. What he didn't know was that on that very night, when he was being watched, fate was already beginning to weave new plans for his life. The next morning, the man in the overcoat, Nathan Collins, a respected editor at one of the biggest publishing houses in the city, couldn't get the scene out of his head. Who was that man? Where did those books come from? And why was he giving them away without expecting anything in return? With his mind racing, Nathan decided to investigate. He visited a few local bookstores and started asking questions. He described the books he had seen the night before. Simple covers, ordinary paper, nothing fancy. Something told him they weren't mass-produced. Books like that? The bookstore clerk furrowed her brow. Maybe you should ask at Leaves and Verses. It's a small bookstore, but the owner has a soft spot for independent publications. Nathan thanked her and followed the advice. As he stepped into the small bookstore, he was immediately welcomed by the comforting scent of aged paper and freshly brewed coffee. The space was cozy, lined with shelves packed with rare titles, and in the corner sat a well-worn leather armchair where a customer was quietly reading. "Can I help you?" A voice came from behind the counter. Nathan turned and met the gaze of a man with kind eyes and a calm expression. It took him no more than a few seconds to recognize Elijah Carter. It was him, the same man from the previous night, but now without the mysterious aura of darkness and biting wind. Just an ordinary bookseller, dressed in a wool sweater and worn-out jeans. Nathan approached cautiously. "I'm looking for a book. I think you might be able to help me." Elijah offered a polite smile. "Of course. What's the title?" Nathan hesitated. What should he say? How do you approach a stranger without scaring him off? But then, he remembered the book he had seen in the hands of the children the night before. A modest title, but with an author's name he didn't recognize. The Hidden Heart. Elijah went silent for a moment. His expression didn't change, but his eyes reflected something Nathan immediately recognized. Surprise. After all, that title belonged to a book that was never meant to be found by someone like Nathan. Elijah kept his composure, but inside, a storm was brewing. How did this man know about the Hidden Heart? Who was he? With a professional smile, Elijah turned to one of the shelves, pretending to search. "Doesn't ring a bell. Do you remember the author's name?" Nathan tilted his head slightly, catching on to the game. "There's no author on the cover, just a pen name. A.C. Whitmore." Elijah felt a chill run down his spine. Whitmore was a name he had created years ago, a pseudonym meant to shield him from exposure. And yet somehow, this stranger was standing in front of him, asking about one of his books. "Ah, I see." Elijah turned back around, crossing his arms as he leaned against the counter. "And where exactly did you find this book?" Nathan smirked. "In the hands of some kids on the sidewalk, and they were captivated." Elijah's heartbeat quickened. He didn't know what to make of this. Did this man simply want a copy, or was it something more? "So, it seems like you found something valuable," Elijah said carefully. "Without a doubt," Nathan confirmed. "But what interests me most isn't just the book, it's the man behind it." A silence settled between them. Elijah knew he wouldn't be able to avoid this conversation for long. "What if I invited you for a coffee?" Nathan suggested casually, though his eyes made it clear he knew exactly who he was talking to. "I just want to hear more about this A.C. Whitmore." Elijah hesitated. Accepting that invitation meant opening a door he had kept shut for years, but at the same time, refusing might only raise more suspicion. After a long breath, he grabbed a sticky note and scribbled an address. "If you really want to know about the Hidden Heart, meet me here tomorrow at 8. Nathan took the paper, read it quickly, and smiled. "Great. See you tomorrow, Elijah." The way he said his name almost sounded like a challenge, and Elijah realized that, whether he liked it or not, his anonymity was coming to an end. The next morning, Elijah arrived at the small cafe at the address he had chosen himself. It was a discreet spot, far from the city's bustle, where he could still hold on to some privacy. The aroma of fresh coffee mingled with the soft scent of old books. A small library lined one of the walls, reinforcing the feeling of a sanctuary for book lovers. He picked a table in the corner and watched the street through the window. The minutes ticked by slowly, and he wondered if he should have declined the meeting altogether. But before he could give in to the urge to leave, the cafe door swung open. Nathan Collins walked in with the confident posture of someone who knew he was on the right track. He spotted Elijah immediately and made his way to the table, placing his coat over the chair before sitting down. "I thought you might change your mind," he said with a half-smile, waving to the waitress and ordering a black coffee. "I almost did," Elijah replied, crossing his arms on the table. "But I'm curious to know what you really want from me." Nathan pulled out a notebook and flipped it open, running his fingers over the pages. "I'll get straight to the point. I'm the editor-in-chief at Collins and Harper Publishing, and honestly, I've never seen anything like what you do. You write powerful stories, print your own books, and distribute them anonymously to homeless kids. That's not just unusual, it's extraordinary." Elijah looked away, uncomfortable with the sudden attention. "I don't do this for recognition, and I respect that," Nathan nodded. "But have you ever stopped to think that your stories could reach so many more people?" Elijah's gaze narrowed. "What if I don't want them to?" Nathan smirked, leaning back in his chair. "Then why did you agree to meet me?" Elijah stayed silent. He didn't have a simple answer for that. Nathan rested his elbows on the table, leaning in slightly. "Listen, I don't want to take anything away from you, but your work matters. And what if there was a way to do this on a larger scale, without losing what makes it special?" Elijah ran a hand over his face, exhaling slowly. He never wanted fame, never wanted recognition, but on the other hand, how many more kids could be touched by his stories if he took a step further? "Tell me more about what you have in mind," he finally said, his voice cautious. Nathan smiled. He knew that at that moment, a door had been opened, and there was no turning back. Elijah went home that night with his mind spinning. Nathan's words echoed in his thoughts. What if there was a way to do this on a larger scale, without losing what makes it special? He ran a hand through his hair and collapsed onto the couch, staring at the piles of drafts and unfinished books scattered across the table. The idea of making his stories public, of seeing them in bookstores instead of just in the hands of street kids, was something he had never seriously considered. He had always believed the magic was in the simplicity of the gesture, in the anonymity. But what if Nathan was right? What if he could reach more children, more people who needed his stories? The doubt gnawed at him. The next morning, he did what he always did when he needed to clear his mind. He walked through the city, stopping by the places where he usually left books. In the alley beside the bakery, he found Sarah, a little girl with curly hair and curious eyes, flipping through one of his copies. "Enjoying the story?" Elijah asked, sitting down beside her. Sarah smiled. "A lot. I always wait to see if a new book shows up. I like to imagine that someone out there is looking out for us, you know?" Elijah's heart clenched. He had never thought about it that way. To him, it had always been just a small gesture. But to these kids, it was something so much bigger. If you could say something to the person who writes these books, what would it be? Sarah tilted her head, thinking. "I'd say, thank you for letting me dream." Elijah felt a lump form in his throat. That night, he opened his laptop and started writing an email to Nathan. "I don't know if I'm ready for this, but I'm willing to hear more about what you have in mind." The next morning, as soon as he hit send, Elijah felt a mix of anxiety and relief. He had spent years keeping his work hidden from the world. But now, for the first time, he was letting someone else step into that universe. Nathan's reply came faster than he expected. "Great, let's talk in person. How about lunch tomorrow? My treat." Elijah hesitated for a moment before replying with a simple, "Okay." The next day, he met Nathan at a quiet restaurant, far from the city's busy center. The editor was already there when he arrived, looking calm and confident. "I'm glad you came," Nathan said, gesturing toward the chair in front of him. Elijah sat down, still feeling a little uneasy. "What exactly do you want from me, Nathan?" he asked, cutting straight to the point. The editor smiled, as if he had been expecting that question. "I want to publish your stories, but not just publish them. I want to keep them authentic. I want you to keep writing the way you do, with the same heart, but on a bigger platform." Elijah glanced down at the table. "And what if I don't want to be recognized? What if I don't want my name on anything?" Nathan nodded. "That's something we can negotiate. You can stay as A.C. Whitmore and keep your identity hidden. But your books could reach thousands of kids instead of just a few dozen." Elijah remained silent for a moment, thinking. "And what if I don't want to change anything about what I write? If I don't want editors messing with my work?" Nathan grinned. "Then we won't. You'll have complete creative control." That answer caught Elijah off guard. It was rare to find an editor willing to give an author that much freedom. Elijah sighed, resting his elbows on the table. "This sounds too good to be true." Nathan smiled, pulling a contract from the folder he had brought. Then how about we take it one step at a time? Elijah took the document, studying it for a few seconds. He still wasn't sure if he was ready, but one thing was certain. The world was about to discover his stories. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid of that. Elijah held the contract in his hands, feeling its weight in a symbolic way. He had never imagined himself standing in front of an opportunity like this. Publishing his books was a dream he had never even allowed himself to have. And now, here he was, about to take a step that could change everything. "No need to decide now," Nathan said, noticing his hesitation. "Take it home, read it carefully. If you have questions, we'll talk." Elijah nodded slowly. The truth was, he already knew the answer. He just needed time to process the change. For the next few days, he carried on with his usual routine. During the day, he worked at the bookstore. At night, as always, he visited the places where he used to leave his books. But something inside him had shifted. Now, every child who smiled while receiving a new story felt like a reminder that this could be so much bigger. He found himself imagining his stories spreading across cities, reaching children who would never see his face but would feel his impact. Finally, after much thought, he picked up the phone and dialed Nathan's number. "I'm doing it," he said, without hesitation. Nathan didn't try to hide his satisfaction. "Great choice. We're about to make history, Elijah." The next day, they met at the publishing office to sign the contract. Elijah scanned the pages one last time. His heart pounded, as if it knew this was a defining moment. Taking a deep breath, he picked up the pen and signed. And in that instant, A.C. Whitmore was no longer just a writer of the streets. He was about to become a published author. Months passed after Elijah signed the contract. His first book, published under the name A.C. Whitmore, was about to hit bookstore shelves across the country. He had never imagined seeing his work come to life like this, yet here he was, on the verge of reaching thousands. The launch was quiet, no big events, just the way he wanted. But to his surprise, sales skyrocketed. People started sharing excerpts from the book on social media, talking about the depth of the stories and how they touched their souls. In the whirlwind of everything, Elijah never forgot the street kids who had been his very first audience. On the night of the book's release, he went back to his old habit. He walked through the city's cold streets and found a small group gathered under an awning. "I brought something new for you," he said, handing out books. The children's eyes lit up as they grabbed the copies. But this time, something was different. On the cover, the name A.C. Whitmore was printed in elegant letters. That name! Sarah, the little girl with curls who always loved his stories, furrowed her brows. "It's the same writer as the other books." Elijah smiled. "Yeah, and now a lot more kids like you will get to read them too." Sarah looked up at him, surprised. "But how did you get so many of the same book?" He chuckled softly, ruffling her curls. "Let's just say, a friend helped me out." From a distance, Nathan watched the scene from inside his car, smiling. He knew Elijah would never change his essence. And that was exactly why his story had become so powerful. As Elijah said his goodbyes to the children and walked away, he felt something he had never experienced before, a deep sense of purpose. He had never wanted fame, never sought recognition, but now he understood. His writing was a gift, and gifts weren't meant to be hidden. They were meant to be shared.